Welcome to Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. This is a two-part series featuring interviews aimed at amplifying the conversation around equity, diversity, and inclusion in the classroom and in higher education. It is meant to be practical, to help everyday teachers like us identify and engage in steps toward inclusive pedagogical practices and systemic changes. No matter where you are in your understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion, we think you will find these conversations helpful and enlightening. And now, please enjoy EDI Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd.
Thanks for joining us today. We are continuing our series of conversations around discussing race and racism in the classroom. And today I'm pleased to be joined by Loretta McGregor from Arkansas State University. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I am really excited for you to be here because I think what you're going to help our listeners with is that issues of race and racism aren't just a classroom issue. They're also important to consider in our advising or mentoring. So can you just start us off with sort of what do you think the most maybe important thing that faculty, particularly white faculty like myself, might not have been taught in graduate school when it comes to mentoring and advising students of color, particularly Black students?
Wow. So there are so many things I think that have not been overtly shared about mentoring students of color, in particular, Black or African American students, that we could spend most of the morning talking about this, but I will try to do my best to encapsulate it within the context of mentoring and academic advising of college students, as well as graduate students for the most part. I think I will hearken back to my own personal experiences of mentoring or being mentored. Both of my primary mentors when I was an undergraduate and when I was in my master's program were white males. And I think that one of the first things that people should understand is that even though students of color actually look for people on campus who look like them, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are longing to be academically mentored by them. They can be easily mentored by people who don't look like them, as long as that person takes the opportunity to get to know them and to understand their experiences within the mentoring relationship. I don't know if that fully answers your question or not, but that was very important for me. I was mentored, as I said, by white males because there were no people who looked like me on campus or in my college or in my department, for example. But there were people on campus who looked like me. So being able to see those other people on campus who look like me, who were professionals, that helped. But then being mentored about what it means to be a psychologist or a psychology major, that actually came from my primary advisors who were white males. And they did a fantastic job, in my opinion, because they took the opportunity to get to know me.
So then for faculty that maybe are prone to being nervous, or they've sort of, adopted the unhelpful messaging of not discussing, people's backgrounds as being important to being formative. But yet we know that we pick up on this, right? These are things we can categorize very quickly in a reaction time task. So should faculty just sort of let students bring up if students want help, or if this feels important, or would it be better just to, lay it on the table in some professional kind of manner? I think I'll just, sort of confess one of those embarrassing moments for myself. Like, I feel like I was in a conversation with a student that I was advising, and I'd sort of brought a stereotype into the room that maybe this person was not as economically, well off as maybe some of my other students are. And I was completely wrong. And that was, I was like, oh, what a way to put my foot in my mouth about that. So, is there a good, do you have again, not speaking for everyone, right? Too, the other thing I want to be careful about with my students, not asking them to represent their groups necessarily, but recognizing that who they are has also impacted how they come into my office.
Right. But, this is psych session. So it's about using our psychological skills. And even though I am not a counselor, all of us are taught to understand human behavior in context. And so just paying attention to the student, getting to know the student. One of the things that I do with all of my students, and my advisors did a very great job of this as well, is that they paid attention to me. Little things like when I came in class, and if I looked extremely tired or downtrodden or anything like that, they sort of pulled me aside later and said, "Hey, what's going on?" Or, "Are you okay? Is there anything wrong?" If I went to their office for an advising session and I sort of looked distracted or something, excuse me, they would take a moment and say, "Are you okay? What's going on?" I have so many students now that I advise, that I have become their academic advisor, that they tell me in our first advising session, you know, my previous advisor, I didn't feel like they cared about me, or I didn't feel like they were interested in me. I didn't feel like they wanted to get to know me. And that is definitely important, not only in mentoring, but also in doing academic advising. We need to get to know our students because psychology is not this monolithic type of discipline where all of the students are going to go lockstep through the program and then end up doing the same thing when they get out. The opportunities are so vast in the discipline of psychology that all of these students are going to be doing a variety of jobs, and they're going to use their psychological skills that we hopefully impart to them, that we need to take the opportunity to get to know them and figure out what they're going to do, and then um, try to help them reach their goal. And this is for any student, but this is particularly true for students of color. Um, as a student of color myself, quite often I felt unwelcomed in spaces, especially spaces where the majority of people were white. They all knew each other, they interacted with each other, or they had this ease with them, and they seemed to have somewhat of a difficulty trying to figure out how to interact with me. When I felt unwelcomed in those spaces, I didn't want to return to those spaces. And so, if our students aren't made to feel welcomed, aren't made to feel like you care about them, um, that's going to affect how likely they are to engage or interact with you.
That's a really helpful and valuable perspective, right? If you just take your advising approach that you have, it sounds like I should have two primary goals, right? Getting to know the student as an individual so that I can better, help them navigate the major in any career or graduate school options.
Absolutely.
But then also ensuring this idea of belongingness as really being central, and recognizing that I might perceive myself as someone that's very, approachable and friendly, but that may not be the automatic assumption that everyone comes to me with. And so I need to make some effort to really maybe even be explicit about that.
Well, we can be approachable and friendly, but if we don't actively demonstrate that, then it goes unnoticed by some students, and especially students of color.
And that, I would just predict that possibly they might have had more negative experiences on average, and therefore, may not walk into every interaction assuming this is going to be, chipper and cheerful, that the risk of things like microaggressions and things like that are more heightened. So that's,
Absolutely.
just sort of considering the risk that I'm asking students to take too in being vulnerable with me is really, a gift that I need to treat as such, and not an assumption that people want to give it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think we also, so we're very good, and I say we as faculty members, we as mentors and advisors, we are very good at compartmentalizing, especially psychology professors. We're good at compartmentalizing our lives. And so we compartmentalize academic advising and mentoring and classroom teaching. And sometimes we may actually say something in the course of our teaching that suggests to a student that they are not valued, or that it makes the student feel less likely to feel welcomed in the space with that particular professor. And so I think we have to be aware of those kinds of things as well.
And do you have a magic answer for how I can get someone to tell me that I did that so I can apologize and rectify, even if it's not direct? I mean, I do say in my courses, like, I really want to create a call out culture because I know that I'm still learning. And the more I learn, the more I realize I didn't know. Um,
Well,
but
I think
again,
that alone is probably enough, because you're acknowledging that you're trying to grow and learn. I think what happens sometimes, though, is that as faculty, we will say something that we have a strong belief about, and that belief really is based on our limited experiences. And so it actually then negate the experiences of others, or if someone else is sitting there thinking, well, this isn't my experience, but it was put out into the class as if this should be everybody's experience, or um, something along those lines, then when we make those type of blanket statements, I think that's when we uh, run the risk of turning some students off or making some students feel unwelcome. But I don't have a magic bullet or a magic answer for you. I'm so sorry.
well, that's
Self
good that it
reflection
sounds
is
like
the
I'm on
best
the right
tool.
track at least.
Yeah, self
I think,
reflection is the best tool.
yeah, yes, okay, that's good. I like some navel gazing. Um, and what you just said reminds me, I have a colleague who I've noticed is very careful when she talks about findings to say, on average, we find
Yes.
that this is the impact. And that is, I think that's a good habit of mind that I could work on, because I talk a lot about variability, but you're right, when you just say something as fact, that's very different than suggesting that, this is the average experience, but that means that there's going to be some people for whom that does not occur. So that's a nice helpful construct for how you can make your just when you're talking to people, make them feel less like you're not don't have space for what they've experienced.
Right. And when I actually teach my students in class about that, the example that I give is I say, look, I said, making these blanket statements, we have to realize they don't apply to everyone. For example, someone can say men don't wear dresses, but that is inaccurate, because there are some men who wear dresses. And then I will put up a slide or a picture of a man in a kilt. And I'll say, this is not called a dress, but it fits the description of a dress. And so, therefore, you can't make blanket statements like men don't wear dresses, because clearly you have here. And then you don't know who you've offended by making that statement at that point.
And I think that, to the end of that point, I think what I also find helpful is that, impact versus intent framing, right? So I should really be most concerned about the impact what I'm talking about has on my students, and not need to spend time convincing them that my intention is good. My intentions are not that helpful if the impact is negative. So I think that's a nice way to think about that. And I should give credit. Robin DiAngelo was the person I heard say that. Many people might have said that before, but
Oh, very good. I'm glad that it stuck with you.
well, this was quite helpful. Maybe just one final question. The other place that I do a lot of mentoring, and I know a lot of our listeners do, is also in kind of research labs and spaces. Is there anything additional that you would kind of want to add that might be different than the classroom or advising in that kind of research mentoring piece that faculty might want to keep in mind?
Yes. So a number of years ago, I actually wrote a book chapter with a colleague of mine, and we actually talked about mentoring ethnic minority graduate students. It was with Bill Hill, who was at Kennesaw State at that time. And one of the things that we talked about in particular in mentoring graduate students is that, especially with minority graduate students, we have to realize that those students quite often have this collective mindset about them. In other words, when they come to college or when they come to university and go into graduate school, they not only bring themselves, but they bring their families with them and the issues of their families. And those students have the pressure of graduate school and research and everything else, along with the pressure of worrying about their family at home or trying to even help take care of their family. Now, this is not true of all minority students, but especially for those students who come from lower economic backgrounds, this tends to be true for them. And so, again, realizing that you cannot treat all of the students in the laboratory the same way. If a student contacts you and says, I'm sorry, I can't make a lab session today, I've got something going on, um, embarrassing that student or calling that student out is probably not the best approach because you may not know what's going on with that student. For instance, when I was in graduate school, when I was in my master's program, I had a 4-year-old daughter who was living at home with my grandmother. So it was her great grandmother. She was living with my grandmother. And I was constantly concerned about both my daughter and my grandmother. My grandmother was in okay health, but I knew that because of her advanced age, anything could happen. And so, um, if I called in and said, I'm sorry, I can't be in lab today because I have to try to make long distance arrangements for my daughter because something's going on with my grandmother, you know, trying to make me feel bad and to make me think that my education should come first is not going to help the situation any. Trying to be a little more compassionate and understanding, that is probably what I need more than anything else, and helping me to figure out how to navigate this situation at the moment so that when I do come back into the lab space or the laboratory, I am not looked upon as someone who has abandoned the group, or I am not treated any differently because I didn't put the science first. Because for me, family came first.
I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. And hopefully, this all of us experiencing a pandemic together maybe has made that feel a little more plausible. Hopefully, right? In case you cringed at not putting the science first a couple months ago, hopefully we're all in a little bit better of a space where we can put, whole human beings first.
I hope so.
And I also think that just harkens right back to what you said about feeling like who you are belongs in the lab, and that's an
Absolutely.
important part of you. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really difficult when you are probably the only student of color in the lab to begin with. You know that you already stand out. you know, there's no question that you already stand out. But then to have other events outside of your control to make you stand out just a little bit more, it makes it very difficult for you to feel like you belong. And it makes it difficult for you to feel like that someone wants you there when there is a lack of empathy.
That's a great point. All right, I'm gonna hold that in my back pocket for when I start advising students, because I think that's something that I can, my own perspective, right, has always been, well, we don't want to leave participants waiting, but
Right.
that's maybe not fair to my students that may have outside stressors that I don't know about. So being able to reframe that as like, I understand things can come up. Please just let me know. I'll make sure the sign gets out, as opposed to, you failed at this fundamental task. So I thank you. That is something I definitely needed to hear and think about.
Well, one of the things that I did in my lab when I was working with students is I would always try to have at least one or two lab students um, in what I called on call, so that if something came up with a person who was the primary individual for that day, then I could contact one of the on call researchers and say, or students and say, hey, such and such had this come up today, and you're on call. Can you do this? And the students would not only sign up for their regular slots, but they would also then sign up for an on call slot so that, excuse me, so that they could, we could have backup where we didn't have participants who were waiting. But that was just my own personal little task. So that's a freebie that you get today.
Well, that's really good too, because I can also see that then that I think that creates even more of a sense of lab community too, right? It's not just, me working with the research assistants. Now the research assistants are getting more of a chance to work together. So I think that that's it decreases my stress level and increases the efficacy of the lab. So that, I will get your Venmo at the end of the call so I can send you cash for that excellent tip.
That's a freebie. No, no problem.
Oh, excellent. Well, good. I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was really valuable and helpful, and I think our listeners also will be better positioned, for the rest of the summer and when they go back into more intense advising in the fall to do a job that, really, as you said, improves people feeling like they belong. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, you are so welcome. And if I could leave you with just two little summary bits here.
Yes,
Um,
please.
Number one, realize, I think all faculty should realize that quite often the students of color, when they enter into an environment where they are truly the minority, they question whether or not they are welcomed, and they don't feel welcome. So they're very cautious to begin with. And then number two, I think it is incumbent upon the majority in that space to make them feel welcome, to do things overtly to help them understand that they are indeed welcome in this space. And once you show me that I am welcomed into a space, I will open up and work with you, and we'll have a great relationship. But I can't I can't be left to feel like I'm always trying to prove myself in this space. And I think that's what a lot of Black students in particular and a lot of Latinx students feel. They feel like, I'm not quite sure if I'm welcomed in this space. And then additionally, no one has shown me that I'm welcomed in this space. So that's just something to sort of keep in mind.
Yes, those are excellent final tips to keep in mind. Thank you so much for those and for your time today and your expertise. And if people want to get a copy of the book chapters that you referenced, should they give you an email you, or they could email me? What's your preference?
Doesn't matter. They can email either you or me. I think I also have made them available on a few sites where they can download them for free. So, yeah, they can just send an email.
All right. Terrific. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you. I appreciate it.